Good morning, everyone. It's the second day, 9 a.m. Made it onto the bus to get here. Thank you for showing up. So I attempted to have the most ambiguous and provocative title of the session. I don't know if I managed to do that. So from my perspective, and I'm talking to those other students in the room, the impacts of climate change are definitely going to be the most significant environmental challenge of this century, and it is very likely that will also be the largest social and economic challenge of our time. And we need a lot of help to address those challenges. So the purpose of my presentation is actually not to talk about me, it's to talk about you. It's to talk about how we need your help to address these challenges. And I hope as I go through these next 15, 20 minutes, that you can see yourself in some of the research that we're doing currently and how you guys can fit in for what I hope to be a lengthy 30, 40, 50-year career right in the middle of this century, because we're gonna need your system. So NOAA every year puts out a statistic on how many billion-dollar damage weather and climate disasters there are in our country. And from the 42-year period, from 1980 until last year, we averaged $7.4 billion disasters in our country. That's a lot. In the last 5 years, we've averaged 17.2. So over 40 years, we had 7.5. In the last 5 years, we have more than doubled that to 17. Here's the graphic from last year, courtesy of our folks at the Weather Service and Satellite Service. Hail, hurricanes, flooding, tornado, fire. It's getting more and more frequent and more damaging, and these numbers are adjusted for inflation every year. So we're not comparing $1980 to $2021. This is only point events. This doesn't take into consideration the incipient rise of the sea level and what that's going to do to our coastal infrastructure, which is mostly what I'm going to be talking about in the resilient coastal section this morning. So I work for the National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science. That's the science office within the National Ocean Service. And I'm going to talk with you about the research that we're doing that promotes resiliency in our country. And my hope is by giving you this buffet of what we do, you can see yourself contributing in some way through your research. So I'm going to give you several examples of the kinds of science that we do. So along coasts, pictures like these are becoming more and more frequent. So inundation, following storm events, pretty significant private and public infrastructure losses. And this is actually, I'm not sure what this is. So this is actually not associated with storm. That is simply high tide flooding in a historic downtown. So that's sunny day flooding, just water rising due to
Do you know where that is?
It's like Annapolis.
That is Annapolis. The little picture is Annapolis. Yes, near where I live. So, additional imageries. Earlier this year, the National Ocean Service put out sea level rise technical report. Unfortunately, it did not have a jazzy title, but it's a really important document. It says over the next 30 years, we will experience as much sea level rise as we experienced over the last 100 years. So we're compressing 100 years of sea level rise into the next 30, and there's not much we can do to stop that. That's already baked in. So many places around our country are going to have up to 12 inches, like a foot of sea level rise. That's going to be highly variable around the country. That's going to cause significant change to how we live, where we recreate, how we earn a living. So what are we doing within the National Ocean Service to help to address this? Well, I'm going to talk about a couple of different pieces of our science. One is focused on using natural infrastructure, marshes, barrier islands, oyster reefs, to improve resilience. So this is an example of a project we have worked on with the Army Corps of Engineers. This is Beach Haven, New Jersey. It is on the Jersey Shore. A lot of built infrastructure, pretty expensive homes, lots of tourist activities. Oceans to the right. This is Mordecai Island. This is remnant of Mordecai Island. It's on the bay side of the Jersey Shore. And it has protected this beach haven community from waves. Predominant winds are from the west, from causing erosion on the community side. Uninhabited island actually really important for migrating waterfowl. It's been eroding. You can see that there are just little remnants. And so we worked with the Army Corps of Engineers to drop in dredge material from the nearby shipping channel. And the hope is that we can reestablish marsh, connect these lobes of the island, and that it will naturally replenish. This was done in 2015. There's an image after it, and that image on the right is from 2019. Similar effort taking place in Chesapeake Bay. This is Swan Island, and that is the town of Ewell, Maryland. Sea level rise 2.5 feet above water. Those that aren't from the mid-Atlantic, the cultural significance of Chesapeake watermen and women is really significant. Inhabited islands in Chesapeake, they're down to only 4. Very culturally significant. They make their living from water. They have an outsized influence in politics. This is a drone image after restoration. You can see it was eroding. Camera person turns around. They're looking at 20 miles of open water across Chesapeake Bay into the mouth of the Potomac. And so this island, Swan Island, was bearing the brunt of a 20-mile-long fetch across the open water. And that's why it caused erosion. And without this, those waves are going to hit one of the last remaining inhabited towns on Chesapeake Bay Island. So we worked with the Army Corps of Engineers, very similar project to Mordecai Island. Beneficial reuse of dredge material planted by our partners with marsh grass, and we are now monitoring. I don't have a more updated image, however, from a drone. However, it is now lush with salt marsh grass. Our partners at the state are monitoring submerged aquatic vegetation around the island, and we're doing monitoring. It isn't for adaptive management of this project. The monitoring we're doing is try to develop lessons learned so they can apply it elsewhere in the country. Third project brings in a different partner. In this case, the Department of Defense. This is in North Carolina at Camp Lejeune, a major training site for our military. They have literally billions of dollars of built infrastructure at the base, and they're protected by coastal marshes. Sea level rise is increasing, land subsidence is dropping it. Those coastal marshes are eroding, and this is an image of how that erosion takes place. The intercoastal waterway is at the top. It gets overtopped, and they form these pools, almost perfectly circular, that then expand out and eat the marsh from multiple directions. And so what we have done is worked with the Department of Defense to pull sediment from the intercoastal, dump it in here, and to determine what we need to do to eliminate these pools so that the marsh is not eaten from within, in essence. And that is going to assist it keeping up with sea level rise. There are other images which I don't have that we're applying a thin layer of sediment to the entirety of the marsh to determine whether that amount of sediment is going to be sufficient to allow it to naturally keep up with sea level rise. Any day you can do research on a stand-up paddleboard, I think it's a good day. Unfortunately, I am not in any of these images. All right, switching gears. Different kind of restoration. In this case, coral reef restoration following hurricanes Irma and Maria a few years back. So tremendous loss of coral on the reefs. A lot of these were fragmented. We had the opportunity to do restoration. So that's not science. That's straight up restoration, reattaching corals on the reef. Images here, and here are Acropora palmata. That is a species that is threatened with extinction of the Endangered Species Act. We are reattaching them for that purpose. However, where we came in to do the research with partners at the U.S. Geological Survey and academics is to determine if we can reestablish a reef crest, how much wave energy is eliminated by that reef crest. So as it comes from the open water offshore, the waves will build, they will begin to crash at the reef crest. Tremendous amount of energy is dissipated. As it goes across the reef flat, lessen further, there is less shoreline runup, less erosion. During a storm, less inundation. And so our partners have determined that healthy reefs in Puerto Rico and Florida save $180 million per year in avoided flood damage to upland structures. Now, our reefs are in trouble. We're having to spend a lot of money to restore them. Here is one estimate of some of the economic benefit of restoring reef crest specifically for eliminating wave runoff and associated inundation. Here's a graphic. Hey, they do work. Wonderful. So this is funded research. We have both internal scientists and we fund work externally. This is from an external project of ours. We are looking at two different things here. One is, what does storm surge look like in the future with sea level rise? And it isn't simply put an addition of sea level rise onto what's going to happen because the dynamic nature of dune and marsh systems. And so what we have here is sea level rise, wave, wind, and surge. And what you can see in the graphics is a dune system is going to be eroded and migrate inland. Our built infrastructure doesn't move. Similarly, the marsh can migrate inland to a point and reaches an area where we've got upland coastal forest, and we lose the marsh, losing protective value and ecosystem services. So these are very generic, meant to be consumable graphics that are coming out of really complex ecological modeling at site-specific levels that we can provide managers to understand, honestly, that marsh is going to be lost. It doesn't have room to migrate because of a road or an upland forest or some other escarpment. If you're going to spend restoration dollars, avoid those areas. Here are much better areas where your restoration dollars can be invested. That's one application. Here's another. Doing research on technology that's 1940s, sand fencing. So, mentioned wave runoff. We've often destroyed our coastal dune systems, particularly on the northeastern Gulf coasts. We've tried to restore them. We've built a lot of houses, a lot of vacation properties, a lot of coastal infrastructure right along the beach. We've put dunes back in. They haven't always been successful. Why not? Well, we're using really old technology of beach fence and multiple species of dune grass to determine how can we reestablish using natural processes that are less expensive than simply dumping sand after every storm to protect the built infrastructure behind. So here's an image of what we don't want, which is a coastal homeowner with their own beach access that gets destroyed after every coastal storm down a really steep dune system. Instead, what we want is this, which is about 18 inches of dune fencing at the ocean edge that was 4 feet when it was installed. So that sand fencing, because of the coastal process research that was done, was installed in such a manner to be able to trap sand behind it, burying the fence, which is what we want to see. And the dune grass is now growing from the bay side across the top down onto the ocean side. And it's a much more stable dune structure. It's going to change restoration. It's going to make it a lot less expensive. Pumping sand is really expensive. Installing dune fencing is not. It's not correct. Shifting gears again on our research. There are two other partners, and one of the things I'm trying to convey here is that partnership is supportive. This is Outer Banks in Hatteras National Seashore, Park Ranger there. That road isn't going to be usable anytime in the near future. And on the right is a partnership in the location that we're doing research with the Department of Transportation, Federal Highway Administration, that we are connecting coastal resilience to where they are investing and how they're designing public investment. And in this case, it's highways, but we're also doing this for fire stations and hospitals, things that are critical in emergency situations that have to be resilient. So a lot of what I've just shown you is on the landward side of the coastal margin. We also love sticking our faces in the water. And here's an example of scientific support provided to Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary. Just came out a couple of months back, 2 months back or so. We did assessments of the living marine resources, human activities, and the ecosystem services that are derived by those adjacent communities from the resources within the sanctuary. This is information that's going to feed into the revision of the sanctuary's management plan and the determination of how they manage their resources in a change of plan. Marine mammals. Every marine biologist apparently studies marine mammals, even though we don't. That's a perception, right? Everybody loves dolphins. This is an example of a project that we're looking at in the Gulf of Mexico, where we're using underwater microphones, hydrophones to determine species distribution. And that is going to give us information about where these animals are in time and space, so we can advise those that are permitting, maybe offshore energy like we talked about yesterday, or aquaculture, or the laying of undersea oil and gas pipelines, so that we can provide information to avoid conflicts with sensitive resources. We've got to manage these as our agency under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Some of these are also threatened or endangered, and we have ESA associated responsibilities. So this is going to give us information about some of these projects, some of these organisms, to avoid conflict with development projects. So going from the warm waters of the Gulf to the warming waters off of Alaska, and that's a big challenge. Don't sit down. Subsistence hunting of seals for protein is really important to these very small native communities in Alaska. And as the waters warm, harmful algal species are being found in greater concentrations further and further north. They produce toxins, in this case, it's cyclotoxin, bifolic acid. And we are finding bioaccumulation in traditional food sources that were safe to eat for thousands of years. And so we are conducting research on toxin accumulation in these keystone species, not only as an indicator of ecosystem health, but also to provide communities that are dependent upon this literally for sustenance, on what they should and should not eat and what they have to consume. So most of what I've talked about has been the intersection of ecology and the human system. Here's another pair of examples. You're not intended to understand any of the colors. We looked at a very rural county on Maryland's eastern shore that had a small town called Oxford. And we looked at vulnerability. Where are the employment centers? Where are the residences? How are those connected? I mentioned resilience of fire stations. You get an emergency call during a storm event, and the fire station is at a sufficient elevation, but the road to get to that person needing assistance is inundated, and then the road from their residence to the hospital is inundated, we have a significant problem. And so we mapped those aspects of vulnerability onto flood risk elevation estimates, and then we prioritized areas for adaptation. And this isn't simply moving people from where they live, it is looking at infrastructure like roads or bridges and how they're going to be connected in the future, and provided this information at a county scale. And then because we are kind of audacious, we went from this tiny little county on the Atlantic coast across the country and tried to do the exact same analysis in LA. We went from one of the smallest least populated areas to the perhaps most sprawling urban area with the largest population to look at issues of risk and vulnerability, and are providing that information to the cities within this. That's still a work in progress. This one's been done. And then I think nearly to wrap up, we talked about offshore energy here, and we talked about the issues of social perceptions. And I'm really glad that came up in so many of the groups. Here's an example of an actual study we did, 5 counties in South and North Carolina for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to get at social perception. So we interviewed folks. This is just one slice of the data. The lighter color means they are supportive of offshore energy. The darker color means they're less supportive. There are some differences between the two states, but just over 50% are supportive of offshore energy, and about a quarter, this wedge, are neutral. Well, that means we've got about 15 to 25% in both counties that are somehow actively opposed to offshore energy from these 5 counties. And that's useful information for BOEM to consider when they're permitting these activities. So here's an example of straight up social science to inform what you guys worked on yesterday as a student. All right, so that was a quick set of vignettes about our research. What I wanted to convey was whether you are a marine biologist, an estuarine ecologist, an oceanographer, social scientist, a statistician, someone who's interested in remote technology, big data, AI, the whole breadth of this. This is just one office building. There are dozens of offices like mine conducting research across all of these topics. I hope that you can see yourself applying the skills you're learning now to some of these problems. Now, since you sat through this talk at 9 a.m. on the second day, I'll let the students know in here that by the end of this month, we will distribute from my office an announcement for 4 recruitment actions for students from the CSCs. It's a federal job. They do not go through USA Jobs. They're direct hire authority. Put in a resume. You'll have an interview with the branch chiefs. If you're selected, you're made an offer right there. It's a much simpler process than going through USA Jobs. I'm going to distribute those to the CSC directors, and hopefully they'll pass them along. My info is in the app, so let me get the app. If you haven't seen this announcement from your center director and you're interested, in the first week of May, send me an email. I'll make sure you get it through. We want you guys to come work for us. We have needs. These are just a small slice of the needs that we have, the topics that we're working on for our district. I'm hoping you guys see yourselves in a situation to be able to assist us with that. All right. If I have questions, time for questions.
Yes.
All right.
5 minutes.
All right. Couple minutes for questions.
Just,
He's deferring to you.
oh, wow. Thank you. The community vulnerability assessment you're talking about with flood risk, it sounded like just counties are, is that going to be a more widespread project?
It depends. So the question for those that are in the ether was, are we doing that county level vulnerability assessment elsewhere? Our goal was primarily the development of the methods. We're a nationwide science organization. There are over 3,000 counties in the United States. We can't do this. We wanted to develop the methods and test them in a couple of bookend case studies. So it is not our intent to do them broadly. Our intent was to develop the methods. Now we are providing results locally because they use certain. We may do this a couple of other places. That would be for further methods development purposes.
I have so many questions, but part of that was the one that you just got asked, was how expanding this, how do you scale this sort of analysis? So is there then, you've done the research, is there a way to try to pass that on to other entities so that they can do the same sort of analysis, or maybe compare with other entities to see if you can improve theirs?
Yes.
Because I'm thinking of lots of specific places, of course.
Yeah.
And you're can't do all of them, right?
That's absolutely true. Although you can ask, I can't tell you to ask Congress students. Sorry, I won't ask you to tell them. I can't do that.
I do it anyway.
But I hit partnerships really hard. And
That's
so
my next question.
yeah, so I hit that really hard. So there are 52 Army Corps of Engineer districts around the country. The Galveston district alone, which spans the coast of Texas, is at least 2 of your schools. Their annual budget is about $550 million. And multiply that by 52. They don't all get that, but what we're talking, that's regular appropriations in the hundreds of billions of dollars per year in coastal infrastructure. If we can green up their practices just a little bit using our science as a lever, we've made a pretty significant impact on the environment and coastal communities. Similarly, if we can prove to the Department of Transportation how they need to change some of their funding practices for local road investments, that's how we're choosing. We also spend a fair amount on tracks. I think I'm close to done.
That time.
I got another question. Yes.
Let me see if I can word this correctly. Are there any active projects within that are retrofitting infrastructure from already existing cities to accommodate for the new sea level rise?
So most big cities in our countries have developed something like a resilience officer or a resilience department. They're looking at you. Offhand, I can't think of research that we're doing with one of those cities right now. The answer is yes, but I don't think we're in. She's the chair.
We do have
Oh,
one more.
I was gonna ask in the estimate of the changes in $1 billion losses per year. I mean, you did talk about that was adjusted for inflation. I'm wondering if any attempts have been made to tease out the changes in natural disasters due to climate change, for example, versus the changes in losses due to increased infrastructure.
Yeah, so the United States, NOAA used to call these weather disasters. And they have changed the terminology to weather and climate disasters because they are late. There has been a pattern of what kinds of disasters, so wildfire and inland riverine flooding are the two that have increased significantly. The pattern of hurricane damage is, there's no pattern, it's very well head down over time, but there are categories of losses, those icons, wildfire and riverine based flooding are. Thank you all.